So, 1 week ago Next.js 16 dropped, and it came with something called cache components, which honestly is a complete game changer. It's basically a layer built on top of partial pre-rendering, and it lets you cache dynamic sections. Sounds confusing? Well, don't worry, because in this video I am going to break down exactly what partial pre-rendering and cache components are and how they work together. We will even build a real Next.js application with static sections, dynamic sections, and of course cached dynamic sections, all powered by cache components. So, without any further ado, let's go! Alright, so before we now implement cache components, you have to first of all understand what cache components even are. So let's head over to the Next.js documentation, and inside of here you will find a section called cache components. And inside of here they say cache components is a new approach to rendering and caching in Next.js that provides fine-grained control over what gets cached and when, while ensuring a great user experience through partial pre-rendering, or in short PPR. Now you might say, cache components? PPR, partial pre-rendering, cache components built on top of partial pre-rendering? Huh? What does that mean? So here's the thing, cache components is pretty much a layer built on top of partial pre-rendering, or in other words, partial pre-rendering enables cache components to work. So before we dive into cache components, you have to first of all understand what partial pre-rendering even is, because that's the foundation. So here's the thing, what rendering types do we have in Next.js, or in other words, how many rendering types do we have in Next.js? Now, if your answer is 2, then you are right, because there are 2 rendering types. First of all, static pre-rendering, or in general static rendering, and dynamic rendering. So this is my website, Marshall Code, and this is my homepage. If I now do a hard refresh, I instantly get a response. Why is that? Or as an example, let me navigate to the ultimate Next.js course route. As you see right here, the navigation is instant, and that's because this route is statically rendered, or in other words, pre-rendered on the server. So here's the thing, once I build my application, or let me break it down a bit further, once I deploy my application to Vercel builds my application, and with that it analyzes my routes. Inside of here I don't fetch any data, therefore Next.js sees, hey, it does not make any sense to render this page on the server, let's statically pre-render this page on the server, and then we will take the HTML and put it into a CDN. Now, as you all know, a CDN is distributed globally. This means if you make a request from Germany, then my website will be served from Germany, because in most cases there should be a CDN server in Germany, in India, in the US, in the UAE, and so on. So these routes are statically rendered, or in other words, pre-rendered on the server. But now let me show you another example. Let's go to the free tutorials route, and if I now open this tutorial, you see right here that there is a delay. Why is that? Well, it's quite simple. This route is rendered dynamically. This means if I now make a request to this route, my request has to hit my origin server. In this case, my origin server is in US East 2, so AWS, and or pretty much the server has to now build or generate the HTML on demand when I make the request, and then send it to me, so this means to the client, and that's why we have a delay. Again, let me show it to you. I will open this tutorial, 1, 2, 3, boom, we have a delay, and that's because I fetched the user session. The user session can't be cached. This is not important. The important thing is that we have static rendering and dynamic rendering. But here's the thing, this is not very flexible. Static rendering is very fast, like once I make a request, I instantly get the HTML and I see the data, which is super cool, but this is not fresh data. So this, for example, revalidates or gets revalidated every 15 minutes, or I think even every hour, if I'm not mistaken. This means my data is stale. If I would now create a course and would not revalidate my data, then I would only see this new course, or in other words tutorial, in 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 2 hours, hours, who knows, whatever your revalidation time frame is, but at the end of the day, your data is not fresh. And in this case, this route does not render fresh data. The same thing is also true for the ultimate Next.js route. This data is stale. It does not update. But if we now look at this route, which is dynamic, as you all know, or in other words, it's rendered dynamically, then you will see that I get fresh data. If I would now update the title, I would instantly get this new data, this new updated title. If I would update the price, I would instantly get the update, because this HTML has to get generated every time when a request hits the server. But this is not great, because as you see here, the request takes a bit to fully load, or it takes a bit for the HTML to be generated and sent to the client. So this is not perfect. At the end of the day, it would be great to have a third rendering solution which would allow you to render certain parts statically while other parts dynamically. As an example, in this case, it would make a lot of sense to render this statically, but for example, this here should be rendered dynamically. So I want you always get fresh data. And for the longest time, this was not possible. But then with Next.js 14 or 15, I'm not sure right now, partial pre-rendering got released. And partial pre-rendering is a solution which allows you to render certain parts of your page statically and other certain parts dynamically. So in this case, this could be rendered statically, and this here could be rendered dynamically, and then the bottom section could be rendered again statically, because I don't fetch any data inside of here, so static. So now you know what partial pre-rendering is, and now you might say, hey Jan, so if we have partial pre-rendering, why do we need cache components? Well, here's the thing. Partial pre-rendering allows you to use both rendering types, but it does not really allow you to cache these dynamic parts. As an example, again, this here is static and the bottom section is dynamic, as we already know with PPR. But if I wouldn't use cache components, then I wouldn't be able to cache the section. So pretty much as they say here, cache components allow you to mark data and even parts of your UI as cacheable, which includes them in the pre-render pass alongside static content of the page. And here they also mention, before cache components, Next.js tried to statically optimize entire pages automatically, which could lead to unexpected behavior when adding dynamic code. So since we now know what cache components are, how they work, we can now also finally implement them. So right here I created a demo code base, a Next.js application, and this is a block application. And let's analyze this page. So I have this title, description, a button, then right here I say, hey, fast performance, beautiful design. I render the total block articles, posts, so in total 3, and then at the bottom I render all of the posts, and then at the complete bottom I have a footer which just says build with Next.js 16 and so on. So if you now analyze this page, you will see right here, okay, I don't fetch data inside of here. This means this can be static. I don't fetch data inside of here. This can also be static. The same thing is true for this section. But inside of here, I get my total block posts. This is dynamic. The same thing is also true for this section. This is dynamic. And the bottom section, the footer, is static because I don't fetch any data inside of here. This is a perfect candidate for partial pre-rendering, or in other words, cache components. So let me show you the code base. This here is my page.tsx. Let me zoom in a bit. So we have an export default function. This is asynchronous, and inside of here I fetch data. So I get the total count. This is what I render right here. And then I also get my block articles, my block posts, to render them right here in the dynamic section. Let's look at the return statement. So this is the static section. This is all fine. Static, static, static. And here, this is my first dynamic section. This renders the count. On the top, I fetch my data, await promise.all, and then I just render my data down below. The same thing is also true for my block articles. I get my block posts, I map over them, and then I render them down below. So this is nothing groundbreaking. This is standard Next.js, but how can we now enable PPR? Or in other words, how can we finally implement cache components? Well, it's relatively simple. The first step is to open the package.json, or maybe before we do that, let's build the application and let's see what rendering type we use right here. So if I say pnpm1 build, it will build my application locally. So creating an optimized production build, and as you see right here, the index page is a dynamic route. This means server rendered on demand. Whenever a user currently makes a request to this route will always be generated on the server. So it's dynamically rendered, which makes it great for fresh data, but it takes a bit to get our data. But as you now know, we want to have certain parts which should be rendered statically. So let's open the next.config file, and inside of here we want to set the cache components flag to true. So with that we will enable cache components. So this is step number 1, but we are still not finished. So let's go back to the documentation to see what the next step is. And the next step is to wrap our dynamic data in suspense boundaries. So here's the thing, if you currently go back to the block application, you will see that we get an error, and it says right here, uncached data was accessed outside of suspense. So whenever you use cache components, you want to wrap dynamic data in suspense boundaries. This allows Next.js to stream its content to the user as soon as it's ready without blocking the rest of the application. So let's go back, and instead of fetching the data inside of here in the export default function, I will instead create an async function. This will be called block post list, and I will put my data fetching inside of here. I now get my data, but I will also render my UI inside of here. So let's scroll to the bottom, and instead of rendering this div, I will instead copy it. So let's copy it together and let's paste it above into this async function. So I will create a return statement and paste it inside of here. So now we have this async function. So I will copy the name of the function. Let's go back, and then inside of here, instead of just rendering the component as is, as mentioned, we want to wrap it in suspense boundaries to tell Next.js that this is a dynamic section. So let's import suspense from React. I won't add any fallback for now, and let's do the same thing also for our count. So I will collapse this async function, and we want to create another one. This will be called total posts, and inside of here we will fetch our data and then render the count. So I will copy the name of the component, and again I will wrap it in suspense boundaries. Let's go back to our export default function. Let's delete this query logic. I will also delete the async modifier because this function is not asynchronous anymore. And if we now go back and do a hard refresh, nothing will change. But the interesting thing is this is now rendered statically, and this here is rendered dynamically, including this total posts. Don't believe me? Let me show you. If I open my terminal and rebuild my application, then you will see right here that we will now get a new result. Our index page is not rendered dynamically anymore, but instead pre-rendered as static HTML with dynamic server streamed content. Oh my god, this is PPR, partial pre-rendering. Again, let me show it to you. This here is rendered statically. It's pre-rendered on the server, and then later on it will be served from a globally distributed CDN. This here is rendered dynamically. Whenever a user makes a request, the server creates the HTML, or it generates the HTML at runtime. The same thing is also true for this section, and I think my dev server is not running anymore. And then our footer, of course, is also rendered statically, but right now we just implemented PPR. But there is another thing. We wanted to implement cache components. This means we want to cache our dynamic sections, and that's exactly what we will do right now. And if you go back to the documentation, you will find another section called cached data with useCache. Add the useCache directive to any server component to make it cached and included in the pre-rendered pre-rendered shell. You cannot use runtime APIs from inside a cached component. You can also mark utility functions as useCache and call them from server components. Let's go back to our async functions, and now above this query I will just say useCache. That's it. Let's do the same thing inside of our other async function, total posts. I will just add the useCache directive, and that's it. And you know what? Let's again go back. I will do a hard refresh and nothing will change for us right now. But let's rebuild our application. So if I say pnpm run build, it will build our application, and in a second you will see that this route is now pre-rendered as static content. So this is now completely rendered statically, which is quite cool. But cache components give you the power to decide what should be completely cached and what should not be cached. As an example, total posts should maybe not be cached. So this could be cached, this could be a cache component, while this can be just a normal dynamic section. So if I now rebuild this pnpm run build, then you should see again something new. Let's see. And yes, inside of here you will see that our index page is again rendered partially. So partial pre-rendered as static HTML with dynamic server streamed content. This here is now rendered dynamically. There is zero cache, but our blog posts are now rendered statically. They are cached and they will be revalidated every 15 minutes because the default of useCache is 15 minutes. The data will be pretty much stale for 15 minutes, and after 15 minutes the data will get revalidated automatically. And I will also quickly add a fallback for the suspense. So I already created a skeleton component. I will do the same thing for the other suspense boundary, and if we now go back, you should now see a skeleton for the total post count. So if I do a hard refresh, we don't see anything, and right here for a split second you saw a skeleton. But now you might say, hey Jan, 15 minutes is good, it's cool, but it's not flexible enough. I want to revalidate my data every 5 minutes, or maybe every other day or every other week, who knows. 15 minutes is not flexible enough. Is there any way to update the cache live? Yes, thankfully there is. So Next.js offers a function called cache live, and this function is used to set the cache lifetime of a function or component. It should be used alongside the useCache directive and within the scope of the function or component. Let's go back, and then in this component where I use the useCache directive, I can now say cache live. This is imported from next/cache, and in this case default is set as a default, and default means 15 minutes. But if I now say, for example, hours, our data will be revalidated every 60 minutes. So right here they also have a little table on the cache profiles. Default, as mentioned, is 15 minutes, seconds is 1 second, hours is 1 hour, days is 1 day, max is 30 days, and so on. I think hours makes the most sense, every hour, and if you want to, you can also create custom cache profiles. So in the next.config file, you can, for example, say bi-weekly, every 14 days. But now you might say, okay Jan, this all sounds cool, but how can I revalidate my data? So right here I have a create new post route, and users can create new blog articles by adding a title, content, and image URL. And whenever a user creates a new blog post, I want to revalidate my data. But here's the thing, I don't want to revalidate the whole page. Not everything should rebuild, but instead only this section should re-render, rebuild. And the same thing is also true for this section. The data should get revalidated. But this, the static content, should stay as is. It should not re-render, not refresh, or anything like that. So the first step is to go back to our page.tsx, and we can add a cache tag. The cache tag function is imported from Next.js, and inside of here we can set a tag which we can then later on revalidate. So in this case, blog posts makes the most sense. We can also quickly look at the documentation. So the cache tag function allows you to tag cached data for on-demand invalidation. By associating tags with cache entries, you can selectively purge and revalidate specific cache entries without affecting other cached data. So we now have this cache tag. Let's open the server action, and inside of here, instead of using revalidate path, I will instead use update tag. So update tag, this is imported from Next.js, and as an argument, I will pass the key. In other words, blog posts, and in theory this should now work. So if I go back and do a hard refresh, everything still works. I will add a title and some content and an image, and if I now click on create post, I should get redirected, and as you see right here, this number updated. That's because this is rendered dynamically, and we should also see the new blog article. Yes, this is my gibberish and the gibberish content. So this worked exactly as expected. I can also add a tag for the other property or for the other component. So let's also mark this component with the useCache directive. I will cache my total posts count, and then for the cache life this will be hours, for the cache tag this will be total posts, and then in my server action I will add another update tag function, and for the argument this will be total posts. So this key matches this key which I added in the cache tag. So if I now go back and do a hard refresh, everything still works. For the title this will be cache tag. So let's create another blog post, and if I now click on create post, it will redirect me. We have the new count or the new total amount, 5, and I see my new blog post right here. Revalidation should work. So this worked exactly as expected, and these two dynamic sections are now cached. So as you see here, it's super easy to revalidate data, or in other words, to invalidate data. Just add a cache tag, something unique, and then use the update tag function in your server action to trigger this tag, or in other words, to revalidate this specific cache component. But now you might ask me, hey Jan, can I use this update tag function also in route handlers? No. Wait, what? Yeah, kinda stupid, right? So if you go to the documentation, you will see right here, update tag allows you to update cached data on demand for a specific cache tag from within server actions. Yes, you heard right, not route handlers. This function is designed for read-your-own-writes scenarios where a user makes a change, like creating a post, that's what we did, and the UI immediately shows the change rather than stale data. And in this case, this is fine. I mean, we use a server action, so this works as expected, and we have a read-your-own-writes scenario. But sometimes you want to maybe use ORPC or maybe route handlers. And in that case, update tag, this function, won't work. And instead, you want to use the revalidate tag function. The revalidate tag function allows you to invalidate cached data on demand for a specific cache tag. Now, the interesting thing is that this can be called in route handlers, while update tag can only be called in server actions. And update tag instantly invalidates, or in other words, revalidates the data, and revalidate tag instead does not do it automatically or instantly. What I mean by that is this function is ideal for content where a slight delay in updates is acceptable, such as blog posts, product catalogs, or documentation. Users receive stale content while fresh data loads in the background. So I will be super honest with you. In my opinion, this is kinda a weird thing to do, or in other words, it's very weird that update tag is only supported in server server actions because revalidate tag does not have the same feature set. It does not revalidate the data instantly. So I don't really understand why they created this revalidation strategy. In other words, why they didn't just create one function which works both in server components and route handlers and has the same feature compatibility or feature set. So yeah, that's definitely something that you should know. And I think with that we are finished with cache components. You now know what cache components are. You know how to implement them by first of all implementing PPR. Again, PPR is implemented by just adding the suspense boundaries. A cache component is defined by adding a useCache directive, as we did right here in our page.tsx. This caches your component by default for 15 minutes. By using the cache live function, you can update this time span. So 1 hour, 1 day, 30 days, whatever. Using the cache tag function, you can tag a component and then revalidate it in your server action using the update tag function. And this is how you implement cache components in Next.js. The nice thing is with cache components, we now get a lot of flexibility. For example, this could be cached, but I can uncache this component. So this will now be rendered dynamically every time. I will always get fresh data, and this will be rendered statically. Or in other words, it will be ISR, so I can revalidate it. And the nice thing is, since I use update tag whenever I revalidate data, only this component will be revalidated while this data will stay as is. So there will be no re-renders or anything like that. So in my opinion, cache components are super powerful. It's a very good change. I think a lot of people at the start will be annoyed because it's a bit confusing. Everything is new, but trust me, in the long run, it will create better websites, faster websites. And I'm currently rebuilding my website and I'm implementing cache components. So soon I will have cache components right here. This will be rendered statically and this will be rendered dynamically. But in other words, I will use cache components. This means it will still be rendered statically. But yeah, with that, I think we are finished with this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. It only takes a second and it would mean a lot to me and my heart. So please do it. And now see you in the next video. The next video will be about multi-tenancy, which is super cool. But yeah, for now, this is it. See you in the next one. Over and out. Bye bye.